Good evening, ma'am. Good evening, classmates. I'm Kurt Russell Pabustan, one of the discussant for tonight, and I will discuss the last two principles of second language acquisition relevant to the development of materials for teaching of languages by Tomlinson and the principle of language acquisition 1. Materials should not rely too much on controlled practice. When we say controlled practice, it is a stage in a lesson where learners practice new language in a limited form. It can be compared to free practice, which involves learner producing language using target content freely. The teacher has shown the learners the form and use of the past-passive form. This principle is intended to state that it is still controversial to say that controlled practice activities are valuable. The statements which state that most spontaneous performance is attained by dint of practice, that is according to Sherwood-Smith 1981, and the automaticity is achieved through practice have no evidence, that is according to Bayeux-Woolstock 1988. However, in the absence of any compelling evidence, many researchers agree with Ellis, saying that controlled practice appears to have little long-term effect on the accuracy with which new structures are performed, and has little effect on fluency, that is according to Ellis and Rathbone 1987. Yet controlled grammar practice activities still feature significantly in popular course books and are considered to be useful by many teachers and by many learners. This is especially true with conversation practice, which has been widely used in numerous techniques for the past 30 years despite the lack of meaningful empirical evidence to back it up. In the recent review of new low-level course books, Tomlinson discovered that 9 out of 10 of them provide far more possibilities for controlled practice than for language use. It's possible that students are spending their time doing drills and listening to and repeating dialogues right now all around the world. Next is the materials should provide opportunities for outcome feedback. Feedback which is focused first on the effectiveness of the outcome rather than just on the accuracy of the output can lead to output becoming a repeatable source of input. To put it in another way, if the learner's language is evaluated in connection to the reason for which it is employed, it can become useful and valuable source of information regarding language use. As a result, a learner who is successful in achieving a specific communicative goal will receive positive feedback about the language's effectiveness for future language outcomes. In relation to this, materials developer has to be sure that language production activities have intended outcomes other than just practicing language. Thus, a learner who fails to achieve a particular communicative purpose, for example, borrowing something, instructing someone how to play a game, and persuading someone to do something, is more likely to gain from feedback on the effectiveness of their use of language than a learner whose language is corrected without reference to any non-linguistic outcome. It is important, therefore, for material developers to make sure that language production activities have intended outcome other than just practicing language. The value of outcome feedback is focused on by such writers on task-based approaches as Willis and Willis 2007. Now let's proceed to the principles and procedures of materials development for language learning. Proposals for principled approaches to the development of ELT materials. Materials writers must establish effective frameworks to assist them in producing effective materials for target learners in a principled and cohesive manner. However, before such frameworks can be created, the authors must first select what principles will guide their procedures. Here are some main principles of language acquisition which Tomlinson followed when developing materials, and some of the principles for material development which he derives from other writers. Principle of Language Acquisition 1. In order to acquire the ability to use the language effectively, the learners need a lot of experience of the language being used in a variety of different ways for a variety of purposes. They need to be able to understand enough of this input to gain positive access to it, and it needs to be meaningful to them. That is according to Krashen, 1985. It says here that learners require a lot of experience with the language being used in a number of different ways for a range of reasons in order to gain the ability to use it successfully. They must be able to comprehend enough of this information to obtain favorable access to it, and it must be relevant to them. In order to acquire certain language pieces and features, they must be exposed to them numerous times in meaningful and understandable input. Each contact contributes to the creation of the hypothesis necessary for ultimate acquisition, as well as the expansion and deepening of awareness. Here are the principles of materials development. First, make sure that the materials contain a lot of spoken and written text which provide extensive experience of language being used in order to achieve outcomes in a variety of text type and genre in relation to topics, themes, events, locations, etc., likely to be meaningful to the target learners. Second, make sure that the language the learners are exposed to is authentic, in a sense that it represents how the language is typically used. If the language is inauthentic, because it has been written or reduced to exemplify a particular language feature, then the learners will not acquire the ability to use the language typically and effectively. Much has been written on the issue of authenticity, and some experts considered that it is useful to focus attention on the feature of a language by removing distracting difficulties and complexities from the sample text. Third, make sure that the language input is contextualized. Language use is determined and interpreted in relation to its context of use. The contextualized examples do not contain enough information about the user, the addressee, the relationships between the interactants, the setting, the intentions or the outcomes for them to be of value to the language learner. I can, for example, think of at least 3 different interpretations of "give him the keys, let him drive it." But I don't know what it really means nor why the speaker has used the imperative until I know who is saying it, who they are saying it to, what the relationship between them is, where they are, what has happened before, and what the objectives of the conversation are. Only extended samples of language is contextualized use can provide learners with the information they need to develop awareness of how the target language is actually used. Fourth, make sure that the learners are exposed to sufficient samples of language in authentic use to provide natural recycling of language items and features which might be useful for the learners to acquire. Examples of materials. Tomlinson used what he calls task-free activities to help him to apply principle of language acquisition 1. This involves the teacher at the beginning of every lesson reading a poem or story, or telling a joke or anecdote. There are no questions or tasks after the listening, just written copies of the text for those students who were engaged by it to take home, read, and file away. The students are encouraged to ask questions about the text at any time and to return to read the text they have collected many times. You can also use extensive reading, extensive listening, extensive viewing to help to apply this principle and use a text-driven approach to developing units of materials in which an extensive text drives the skills and language activities of each unit. That's all my report. Thank you for listening.